let's be clear, the question of this debate is not whether gun ownership is objectively good. The question is whether in the US context in which gun ownership is substantial and tied indelibly to the identity of the US political conscience, and the NRA is the biggest political lobby group and donor within the political context, it is preferable that Black Americans are also armed safely, and also have a group with a political legitimate voice in the issue of gun law reform. And to that question, we answer yes. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, whether the existence of a group which would otherwise not exist in a context in which only the NRA could speak on political issues is preferable. Secondly, why it has good practical outcomes in the way that it provides and trains about guns. And thirdly, why the existence of the group is important within the political sphere as a lobby group and for the identities of Black individuals. And first and quickly on setup, it is sufficient to identify that this organisation is one that has existed in the late 20th century and has been particularly strong in the last decade or so. It has had a particularly strong recent resurgence in the context of political backlash against Trump, and there is a significant balance of genders within this organisation. It is predominantly African American, and they lobby not merely for gun ownership, but also provide things like pamphlets and educational information about safety and the ways that individuals can, safely handle, store, and use guns. And they also are not irregularly framed in the media. The burden of this team on GovBench is merely to establish the existence of this group is good. It is not to suggest that in the absence of this group, gun reform would be likely, and we suggest that would be a very difficult thing for this op-bench to prove. So firstly, why it is objectively good that this voice exists in the context in which only the NRA would exist otherwise. And this is essentially a principal point, which is to suggest that in the counterfactual, the only voice within the gun realm, within the US political sphere, would be the NRA for a variety of reasons. Firstly, it obviously has a monopoly within that sphere, and it would be very difficult to challenge that monopoly within gun lobbying unless there was a political identity attached to it, such as African American collectivization, which means it would be very difficult to challenge that power. Secondly, that there is no way that the NRA could be inclusive of Black voices. It is extremely exclusive, and that's for a variety of reasons. Firstly, that it often platforms on historical overtones with white nationalism, and that is often where the NRA has originated from, which means Black African Americans feel unwelcome, even to the extent that it is not actively unwelcome. But secondly, that they often are actively unwelcome, that there is a Republican alignment with the NRA, which is anti-African American rights, that often the language they use is pre-Civil War, that they have an incentive to posit the need for guns is reliant upon a threat, which is often a codified version of saying the Black African American threat, and so they need the otherization of that group in order to get the most effective, stopping of political reform. And that often the individuals within that hierarchy of power, individuals that are white, the individuals that are privileged, the individuals that are Southern and have their own explicitly racist overtones. So there is no space for Black African Americans within the NRA, and in the absence of this group, there would be no voices for African Americans that could meaningfully be heard within the political sphere. And all I suggest here is that these individuals have a right to a space specific to their own voices. And that's not just by virtue of the reason that they are African Americans, but it is to do with the unique interaction between African Americans and gun laws, which is to say they have ownership of guns, but they are also disproportionately legislated against within the legal frameworks to the extent that gun laws are ever passed. But in particular, the use of guns and the way that it is targeted and weaponized and legitimate is against the African American identity disproportionately, in a way that means their voices are particularly important within that debate. And to the extent we establish they have a unique perspective that would not otherwise be heard, it is not for us to suggest that that voice is bad. To the extent it is the African American perspective, it ought to be heard. That alone is a reason why we support this. But secondly, you say it is a good perspective. And all of this is to suggest that obviously we have to defend a marginal increase in gun ownership, though we do suggest it would be marginal for a variety of reasons. That many African Americans have incentives for gun ownership, for example, that they are politically targeted, that they are actively against violence, and it is still entrenched with the US identity that many of them use guns to the extent that that intersects with other forms and access to disadvantages that they face. But secondly, that they have access to it, that it's part of their cultural identity. So we don't have to defend a significant increase. We suggest that increase is one that is preferable because of the types of people that are likely to increase. Because the individuals that would have guns in both worlds are the ones that are least beneficial for the cause of African Americans, because they are likely to intersect with things like crime, with things like poverty. And where the swing gun owners are likely to capture is individuals that are more moderate and are more preferable in the normalization of the imagery discriminatory around African American gun ownership, which is to say that it is normalizing to see individuals that are not criminal holding guns, and often that association is one that is entrenched within the ways that guns are utilized against African Americans. So to break down that perception is to challenge the violence against the African Americans. But secondly, we tell you that it actively teaches the individuals with guns to use them safely. So even if we have to cop, like more guns, we don't have to cop more gun deaths, because the ways that these organizations exist is to, like formally inform individuals. And to the extent that there are educational institutions otherwise, like the NRA still teaches those things, we tell you that the African American community would be less likely to opt into those forms of education or less open to them, whereas this group is one that they find accessible, so they're more likely to know how to, for example, store them properly in a way that means that those guns are less likely to be dangerous. But thirdly, we say that having a gun is something that is legitimate for those individuals. Firstly, that to the extent everyone is armed against you, it is legitimate to be armed. But secondly, we suggest that the ownership of a gun is one that makes individuals, particularly in the American context, feel more safe in a way that means that they are less likely to act erratically, or less likely to do the things which incur the kind of legitimization of violence against them. And that sense of safety and autonomy and independence is one which is particularly important for a community which has been denied that sense of safety by the American context. So the guns are good. Thirdly and finally, on why their existence of a group is important, but first closing, I prefer you.
Yeah, so you've listed reasons why the NRA is bad because it has majority white membership. Isn't part of that because there is a separate body that acts?
Yes, obviously part of it is that there is a separate body. However, we point to structural reasons, we point to the incentives of the NRA, we point to the language of the NRA, we point to its traditions, we point to its structures. We suggest that there may be some Black African Americans in the NRA in your world, but there would never be a voice for African Americans in that world. So why the lobby group is good? Firstly, we suggest that that lobby group has access to politicians. Obviously, the NRA will always be bigger and stronger than this group, but that does not mean they do not access politicians and are not given a seat at the negotiating table. It is very difficult to turn down an African American collective on gun ownership, and that is likely to allow them to have access at the political table in a way that means lobbying can be specifically targeted toward African American objectives. Secondly, that the media has a capacity and an incentive to cover these individuals in a way they would not when it was just disparate African Americans within the NRA, because it is a legitimate institution, because it is aligned with identity, because it is one that is a voice in times of crisis. Thirdly, that it is often an important group for these individuals to turn to in times of difficulty. Guns are used against the African American population more than they are used against anyone else. And when this organization is able to speak up and speak out against those uses of guns, it may not change the law, but it gives those communities a sense of comfort that someone is there for them and that someone is listening. And in a context in which no one is there for you, that is a benefit that cannot be ignored. At the end of this speech, yes, guns have harms. However, African Americans have a right to be a voice within the field of gun ownership. They have a right to be using those guns safely. They have a right to have voices for them in the political sphere. Proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for her speech and would now like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to open their team's case.
Hello. The problem of OG's case is this. The NWGA does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in society where racism is prevalent, where people find that African American community are armed and violent, and where people specifically target the community, which means OG is going to make the status quo worse, and they are going to divert resources from being used to lobby against police brutality and from providing bail funds to this community, which means they're going to make the status quo worse. So a few issues in the debate. Firstly, how they're going to change the police operations in a worse way. Secondly, how they're going to harm the social rhetoric. And thirdly, why they're going to make repealing the Second Amendment impossible. So on to the first issue, why they're going to change the police operation in a really bad way. So I think that if people think that all these African communities are going to be armed and they have an association that actively encourages them to use guns and to teach them to use guns and to act against the police and act against like racism, we think that a few things are going to happen. Firstly, there will be more police on the ground because police and authorities and other people think this area is going to be unsafe because of the prevalence of gun usage. And we think that having more police in the area is on that very bad for the community because there will be like more supervision and more suspicions around these people, and police are going to be like targeting these people even more. And secondly, we think that this is going to change police actions on the ground as well. This means people are more likely to do preemptive actions and more likely to strike before the African community even like act out, because they think these people are probably violent, these people are probably armed, which means they have the reasonable grounds to kill before this African community acts, which means even if they take this police go to court, it is very easy for the police to say, I have a reasonable ground to have this suspicion because of this association, because of this general norm is necessary, which means there is no address for the legal issues in the court as well. And we think that more African Americans are going to be killed by this preemptive strikes. But thirdly, we think that the police is more likely to monitor who goes into this association, puts them like compel and list and target these people specifically as well, because police have an incentive to boost their numbers and have an incentive to arrest more people as possible, which means it is easier for these police to just specifically target these people because it is easier for them to find these grounds in court, and it is easier for them to find instances where they carry guns and use guns as well, which means even if people go to this association, they will be targeted even more, which means our materials about the police operation directly address the problem, directly address the benefits they want to bring you, which is that the African community are going to be safer, and we told you that it is going to be more dangerous, there are going to be more police and more police violence, and this is going to be really bad. But second issue, why the social rhetoric against the African community is going to be worse as well. So firstly, we think that it is going to antagonize the white people and antagonize the politicians for the reason that they are going to act on policy that says you have to be tough on crime because these associations exist and these associations promote gun violence and teach people how to use guns. And I think it is very easy for these white politicians to manipulate the message because they can easily play on the fear that persists in the public. And I think that given all the gun violence that is prevalent and the status quo, it's very easy for the public to believe these politicians because they see this association operating, they see this association promoting guns and promoting like how to use guns, which means it is very easy for the politicians to bring out this tough on crime message and for the public to accept this message as well. And also we think that this will fit into the status quo bias, which says the African American communities, they are violent and they are armed, which means like you are going to be sympathetic and tolerant to these communities, especially if there's a news like in the media that says, oh, African American killed a person or African American killed the police. We think that in this instance, the public is less likely to be sympathetic and tolerant to this community because the public is going to say, well, the association already taught you like how to use guns and used to use it wrong, which means it is a sole responsibility of your community, and your community has failed, this association has failed, and this is why you have no legitimacy, and it is okay for us to be tough on you, and it is okay for us to impose like police sanctions on you as well. So this is we think that it is not only going to exacerbate the status quo bias, but also we think that this status quo bias is going to evolve into like real harm and tangible harm into this community as well. And OG's response to this is that, oh, but it is so important that African American people can be heard. A few responses. Firstly, they can be heard in other ways that does not include encouraging them to use guns. And we think that like making them heard in other ways, it's going to give them more legitimacy if it is not linked to these guns and it is not played by these like white politicians. And secondly, I think that they never told you who are going to hear them and why media is going to portray them in a positive light, especially given that Republican is racist, which means they are probably going to just like relate to this community and relate to the association. And also given Democratic is anti-guns, which means they probably will not like the association, which means there's like no one in the media that can bring them the benefit. Do you have No, okay. Okay, so third issue, Second Amendment. Why we're going to make repealing the Second Amendment even impossible? So I think that firstly, yes.
Even if there are black identities in their NRA, they will never have a voice. The power of the NRA is stronger than individuals. So black people, even if they are on TV, cannot say their perspective. What are the ways that you get the voices of the individuals on gun law?
Firstly, it is unclear why African community is going to be heard in your case, especially the media is going to portray them in a really negative way, and they will probably not giving them the voice and the chance to say their case properly. And also, we think that you can still have like other ways to bring a voice out without having this negative rhetoric against you. So on to the last issue, the Second Amendment. We think that this association is mutually exclusive from repealing the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment, repealing the Second Amendment involves that you have to get rid of guns, which is in direct contradiction with like encouraging people to use guns, which means that American leaders and politicians who currently support the repealing of repealing the Second Amendment is going to lose their legitimacy, because they're seen as being contradict with their community and with the association, which means they lose capacity to repeal the Second Amendment. That also means that you're going to split the Democrats as well, because lots of people in the Democrats, they do support repealing the Second Amendment, which means they're going to divert resources from getting rid of guns at all by doing this. And we think that even if you can have some gun control bills, that means all the people who are enforcing the gun control bills are going to be the white people, because now all the black politicians are pushed out of the process because they're seen as being illegitimate by this association. And also we think that if this bill is extricated by white people, it is going to be more even racist and even more anti-American community, African American community as well. So at the end of this debate, we think that they cannot bring benefit to the people in the context of America. They're going to make the police operation even worse. They're going to bring the social rhetoric in a really bad way, and they're not going to repeal the Second Amendment in any way. Very happy to do it.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for that speech. I would now like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the opening government takes case.
Panel, NAGA is not responsible for introducing Black Americans to guns. Black Americans already own guns. Black Americans are already the victims of gun violence. Black Americans are introduced to guns by white police officers who shoot children in the street when they are unarmed. This was not a debate in which NAGA gave guns to the African American community, and the comparative is where they would have no guns, but I'll tell you why, even if that was the case, we would still say that was bad. It is one in which the question is how to give a voice to a community that does already have guns and is uniquely affected with the intersection of the experience of gun ownership and their Black identity. That is something that can only be voiced and dealt with by a group which actually understands that intersection of their identity. So, firstly, on the right to a lobby group, which, or like this association, which we had no response to from side or opening opposition, we tell you that even if you believe their material about how that this is something something that creates worse perceptions of Black African Americans and makes them more likely to be racistly targeted, that doesn't undermine all of the practical benefits that individuals get from owning those guns and knowing how to own those guns safely, which means things like they are less likely to have their children have access to a gun. They will use things like gun locks. Children will die less in African American homes as a result of this policy, and that was always a benefit. But secondly, we tell you that these people have a right to their own perception of safety, and it's actually kind of fucked up to be like, in a world in which you face constant violence from white people and armed white police officers, you are not allowed to feel that same degree of safety, even if it is just a sense of perception that you can fight back and that you can actually challenge that and have the capacity to do that. That was also something that was never going to be accessible via the NRA, which closing opposition tries to propose an alternative. Maddie tells you why that's unlikely that African Americans or Black Americans will ever be a meaningful voice within the NRA. Secondly, obviously, they can also be a member of both organizations, and if it's something that's politically beneficial, we would support Black Americans joining the NRA as well as joining this group. And we think, in fact, they're probably going to be more likely to be joining the NRA and more able to join the NRA in a capacity which has a meaningful voice at the point at which they have an autonomous group where they can develop their understanding of gun awareness and be integrated into the gun community and then join the NRA. That's more likely to happen at the point at which they see a community they feel that they can join that is autonomous, rather than the NRA, which will always be perceived of as more alienable to those particular people. Finally, oftentimes they will have separate and distinct goals from the NRA, which we think that NAGA is uniquely positioned to advocate for, and the NRA will never advocate for. Primarily, we would say things like restrictions on the police force's ability to own guns and use them against the community, something the NRA would never support, but something which NAGA is incredibly likely to support given the racialized use of police violence and guns in the police community. That is why having a lobby group that can represent Black interests autonomously is necessary, because that won't be something the NRA would ever advocate for. So, no response yet to this principle from opening government. But secondly, what is the actual practical positive effect of the NRA on Black gun ownership? So, firstly, we hear from opening opposition that this is actually worse because it means African Americans are perceived of as racist, and this increases the likelihood that they will be targeted or they will be over-policed. Firstly, uncomparative to the status quo, in which all of those things already happen independent of NAGA existing, and we just ask you to think about the logic of police officers making their decisions on how they police communities based on the existence of like an association which promotes safe and responsible gun use. We tell you that things like racism and the bias that those police officers have within those communities, the structural reasons why those communities are over-policed in the status quo, all still exist, and they are the predominant reason why those communities are policed. This has a marginal or negligible impact, and to realize that's true, you just need to ask yourself, what would happen if this association dissolved? Would African American people no longer have guns? Would there no longer be gun violence in these communities? Would there no longer be over-policing? The answer to that is no, because the reasons why police are in these communities are different. But also, we think that even if that was true, that is something that is more likely to be subject to scrutiny at the point at which you have an association of gun rights activists that can lobby against that, something that is more powerful when it comes from a position of we are not anti-gun, whereas an anti-gun rights lobby is always going to be perceived of as being anti-gun, and that's why they want the restrictions. This group can uniquely be like, we are pro-gun, but we are pro-responsible usage of guns, and we have unique understandings of how the Black community interacts with guns. That nuance of that position is something that you can never get on their side of the house, which actually means it's less likely to have that perception. But finally, also unresponsive to Maddie's substantive, which was that in the status quo, people are already racist and think that Black people have guns, but they perceive them all to be criminals and members of the dangerous people they should be afraid of. This uniquely changes the narrative, because now it's like the 50-year-old mum or the auntie who has a gun and keeps it safely locked in her drawer for use of defense against an intruder. Obviously, we don't necessarily think that those things are effective, but people perceive them to be effective. That is how people perceive of the right to own guns. That is why the Second Amendment is so entrenched in the American psyche. So what does that mean? You need to compare the scale of the benefits that you get, because our worst harm was that this organisation creates a marginal increase in the ownership of guns, which we tell you is already the case, but it changes the types of people who own guns and it makes them use guns in a safer way, and that benefits not only the extra additional people who are now owning guns, but all of the people in the status quo, like the roughly 1/4 of African Americans who own guns that would own them anyway. That is a huge benefit, both numerically, but also because we told you that those are most likely to be the least privileged members of the community. So finally, on this idea that this capacity to repeal the Second Amendment is affected by another, we firstly tell you that the instead huge lobbying power of the NRA is what means that it is unlikely, if not impossible, that it will ever be repealed. But if it could potentially be repealed, it's not going to be this like 30,000 member strong organisation that is standing in the way of it. Instead, it's going to be, which we tell you is true, because this is a lobby group which only actually ever attracts people who are pro-gun in the first place. What that means is that if you are anti-gun, you're still going to support anti-gun policies. This is a lobby group that attracts people who weren't pro-gun in the first place, which is why it doesn't actually split or fracture that support. But also, secondly, we think that given that this lobby group advocates for regulation and safe gun ownership, it makes steps towards things that would be more likely to lead to the eventual repeal of guns by advocating for restrictions on their usage. Finally, we think that these people will be portrayed positively, partly because the situations in which their gun violence is often used is against African American communities, and that is the point at which they will speak up. There's also bipartisan support for gun ownership, which means that the media has an incentive to put people on TV who are pro-gun ownership, but also come from this association. And the alternative, again, is the NRA, which never has an incentive to defend black people who own guns. At least this organisation does. Even if it's not portrayed positively, it still has a seat at the table.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech and would like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to finish the opening comments.
I will start by talking about the counterfactual, because this is quite a handy way of significantly raising the burden of government bench. Basically, the NAAGA is an organisation that is run by woke black activists who focus on redressing state violence in the way that it manifests itself in especially racist ways. So, had they not poured huge amounts of time and effort and resources into this organisation, they probably would have put this money into other organisations that aim to redress this injustice against black people that is done by the legal system. What that looks like is, one, more legal funding for black defendants who cannot afford good lawyers to defend them. Second of all, lobbying aggressively for police reform, for instance, things like body cams and stuff like that. Or third of all is organising grassroots political campaigns, just simply using this money towards things that have proven track records of getting mileage, rather than simply turning themselves into fodder for Fox News pundits to be extra racist about. What this means is that we point to concrete benefits that would arise that benefit the most vulnerable people in community, the people who are currently brought towards court, rather than these abstract benefits of discourse that have not delivered anything at all, and we have no reason to think will actually bring any benefits. That's why we think we're already ahead of the opening. Now I will talk about basically the single benefit that we hear from side opening government, which is discursive. We think this is wrong for two reasons. First of all, it is premised on the fact that their voice actually being good for discourse. They say, well, there's only like white people who are talking about being pro-guns, and we need maybe like a black voice to add to this. But it's like, if being pro-gun isn't good, why do we need to add this voice to it? Like, if everyone who is pro-life was all white, do we really need to add like people of colour to that discourse? I think this was a big contingency that they didn't even address. But second of all, it was contingent on their voice actually being heard in the first place, which they are not. We said, of course, the Democrats are not going to listen to them because the Democrats are anti-gun, and the Republicans aren't going to listen to them because they're racist. But they're already in the pocket with the NRA, which is a rival rifle association group, and so of course no one is simply going to listen to them. Also, the fact that the motion had an infos line means that we haven't heard about them, you know? So basically at this point, the only impact they have is purely one about that they should just be able to like express themselves, which really just doesn't stack up against the rest of the debate. Free speech is not good in and of itself. It is only good if it leads to certain political outcomes, which they do not get. Speaking of political outcomes, I'll talk about the political costs of the NAAGA. So there actually are political outcomes, but they're all negative somewhat inconveniently beside opening government. Basically, we need to take account of the way that this group is perceived. By their own admission, this group is quite small, which means that the only way that people will interact with this group is through media presentations of this group. And note that the way that the media will present this, because it's a highly racialized like weapon owners group, and this will be perceived in the increasing context that Fox News pundits are always talking about, like upcoming race wars or that sort of image. And so the way it will be presented will be photos of people in camo with giant rifles and balaclavas, which is probably like the method of firing up boomers par excellence. There is like nothing better to radicalize the conservative base, to get people voting for increased policing of these communities, and the people only interact with them through the media, which is the critical part of this case. The presentation of them will not be good. It will be designed to prey into people's worst biases against people of colour, and that is a huge harm for them. For 5 reasons, actually. The first is that over-policing gets worse. They say this was uncomparative. Oh no, sorry, their response was like, oh, well, over-policing is pretty bad. Like, yes, it can get worse. Like, a lot of juries acquit police officers who shoot innocent people, but there are still juries that find those officers guilty. But on their side, there's going to be way less of the cases where people actually are brought before justice. There will be more police brought in. There will be more funding for, say, like SWAT tactics. There will be more funding for, like, way more powerful weapons to be used in here. Juries are more likely to acquit. Things are bad. Yes, use your imagination. They can, of course, get worse. The second is that politics gets way more racist because of these images that are presented in the media of them. Third of all, stereotypes of black people being associated with violence and weapons and breaking the law and having guns gets way worse, which means there is way less support, for instance, for social programs for poor communities, and it's far easier for for congressmen in DC to simply throw their hands up and say, well, like maybe Baltimore should solve their crime problem first. Of course, we're not going to earmark any federal money for that. Fourth of all is gun control gets worse. Their responses didn't actually answer the way that our case worked, which was that any momentum towards gun control now gets redirected in a particularly racist fashion. We would point to the example of Reagan in California only restricting gun rights when the Black Panthers got their hands on full auto rifles. So the policies of gun control will not take weapons out of the hands of white people, only out of the hands of people of colour, which looks like bans on certain types of weapons that are associated that people of colour generally have, but also things like raising prices which discriminate on lines of socioeconomic standards. Last of all, it splits the Democrats. That is, it is likely this is going to be used as a wedge issue to drive black gun owners away from the party that best supports their interests, even if not in a perfect way, and that is really bad, especially in the view of elections coming up. Opening government basically then talks only about gun safety. They say, well, they currently support gun safety. I think the thing is, if people weren't donating to them, they would just be donating to another gun safety charity if they support gun safety. And those other gun safety charities that are like more anti-gun are probably way better at spreading this message. They just have more economies of scale because they're not split on entirely racial lines. That is why the NAAGA is so bad, because it exacerbates the very worst images of black people that the media has, and it gives people basically carte blanche to be as racist as they want. Closing.
Is it okay to discriminate against African Americans because it might advantage them consequentially?
Oh, okay, I guess that's interesting. Like, look, I think it's like you have to make some trade-off in this debate. As in, of course, we would like freedom of expression. We would like there to be more diversity of discourse in the media. But look, if this comes at the cost of shocking electoral defeats, the cost of way more police brutality, and the opportunity cost of rescuing the most marginalised people who are currently languishing behind bars because they cannot afford bail, and that money is being put into vanity projects of buying rifles and laughing, like, I don't think that is, like, I think the trade-off quite easily falls to our side. Look, trade-offs have the good side and a bad side. Like, of course, we're not going to get just completely unmitigated, like, success on our side. So, okay, the last bit is just sort of a bit of substantive, which is basically assuming we want to arm people of colour, that the NAAGA is the worst way to go about this. Basically, there are alternatives that are identified by opening government. That is, for instance, just buying guns independently, or going through other rifle associations such as the Socialist Rifles or the John Brown Gun Club, or joining the NRA, actually. But we think the NAAGA is worse for a few reasons. One is because it's racially exclusive, which means it is small, necessarily isolated. The second is it is a political lobby group, which means it is so tied to political parties that it cannot really stand on its own and accomplish its own goals. But third of all, because it's so highly centralized and racialized that it's just way more likely that the leaders just consistently get arrested, like the leaders of other people like the civil rights leaders and stuff like that. And so it's likely that it's not going to particularly grow because the powers that be take great offense at it. Look, at the end of the day, this policy was one that really, really exacerbated the worst images of black people in the media, but also it just comes at such an obvious opportunity cost. Money that could go to somewhere way better. That's why we're proud to vote
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. I would now like to welcome the Member for Government.
The opening teams have overextended themselves in this debate, because there's clearly a highly vitriolic debate on the ground of the United States that has entrenched interests like the NRA, as told us by our opening, and also is very tied to whiteness. So it's unclear what outcomes really flow from a new lobbying group getting involved, particularly when we're not really sure what they're lobbying about, considering all the different conceptions of what this group does. But equally, the contention from the opposition that this debate is worsened by an image of black families buying guns from Home Depot, when we already have images of gangs possessing illegal guns flooding the discourse, is ludicrous. There's no way that these images ever make it to even the front page or the 15th page of the newspaper when you have a gun crisis in Chicago of people murdering each other with illegal guns. So ask yourself, what does matter in this debate? Who does this organization engage with? They engage with black gun owners. Black gun owners who have a right to bear legal arms, a right that is non-consequentialist against being discriminated against, and a right to legal arms in a world in which they are often forced to illegal alternatives. That is our extension. 3 ways I'll explain it. Firstly, why they're denied rights to legal arms, why they still are able to access illegal guns, and how we fix that problem. Secondly, why non-consequentially you have a right to bear arms and be not discriminated against in that field. And secondly, consequentially, why it's probably banned to force black people who want to own guns to buy them from criminals rather than buying them from Home Depot. One bit of extraneous rebuttal to the idea that, these are black woke people who put their money into better black causes. No real support for that assertion. These are clearly people who care specifically about guns, so they'll defend black gun owners in many of the ways that they want to explain already on the comparative, like representing them if they're mistreated by the police, or they'll just join the NRA because they're misguided and think they're able to reform it, which would also be a huge loss of political capital, so we do not think that is particular in the debate. So, first point, we think they're denied right to legal arms, they still allow access to legal arms. How do we fix it? 2 ways to discriminate against. Firstly, at point of sale. It's clear from our opening that there's a lot of racists in the gun industry who we think discriminate quite aggressively against black people because they don't want black people in their community owning guns. There are many, many, many of these people who own the gun stores, who sell the ammunition and engage in those behavior, actively discriminate against black people, forcing them to turn to illegal alternatives. But secondly, we know that law enforcement is also super racist, right? And they're the ones who have the discretion to turn down your application to get a license for a gun. We have screeds of evidence that black people are often turned away because of all the racist black policing. But they still buy illegal arms. 2 reasons. Firstly, they're terrified. All of the analysis from opening government is good, but the alternative isn't just they buy legal guns, they buy illegal guns because they don't have access to the legal ones. But importantly, they do have access to the illegal weapons. If you go to Chicago, which has passed quite restrictive gun control, it does not have less guns in it because of the way that you don't enforce state borders in the United States and guns are flowing in from all over the place. They're just smuggled and you buy it from the person within your community who points at you because you want to protect your family. How did opening opposition respond to these ideas? They wanted to say, you get more police violence, which honestly is just the status quo. Police officers are super racist. Unclear how that works in a marginal sense. But importantly, now the dominant narrative is illegal ownership rather than legal ownership, right? And that's much normatively worse because illegal ownership will now exist without a counterbalancing narrative that there are legal gun owners that look like you, that are middle class, that just want to buy their gun at Home Depot, and that is necessarily what happens. But moreover, clearly these images aren't the thing that are important. As I pointed out in my introduction, the gangs using illegal weapons to mow people down the street is probably the image that they use to dissuade people to allow black people to have guns. Moreover, it creates a cycle Because the mechanism for why these people buy guns illegally is the mechanism that was pointed out by the opposition. Because the police, if they know you have a gun in your house, are much more likely to shoot you if they come to your house. You don't want the police to know you have a gun. You don't want them to be the one who gets to choose whether or not you are able to engage with it, and that means you're much more likely to buy it legally. How do we help fix it? Firstly, they want to say at opening that the political agenda in some way will be imposed to the NRA. We agree with them. There are some cases of discrimination, but I'll probably disagree with them. But moreover, they'll also agree with the NRA on a lot of things, right? Which means that they'll facilitate access between Black people who want to buy guns and legal outlets that will help them navigate the systems and processes that people and the obstacles that people put in the way to try and dissuade you from doing it. And they're also investigating and calling out acts of racism where gun sellers decide not to sell to Black people or police officers refuse to give people licenses. Two reasons why this is the most important issue in the debate. Firstly, the non-consequential right to bear arms. It is clear that our opening has been very consequentialist. The NRA is bad, they need a sense of safety, we need to educate them about things. What is more important in this debate? Discrimination is non-consequentially a bad thing that should happen for two reasons. Firstly, it is wrong to live in a world in which you are treated badly for the color of your skin. They just want to accept that, if we paternalistically can help Black people, we should deny them the rights that everyone else in that society has. We don't agree with it. But secondly, it also operates on a normative level. We hurt these people even if we don't think guns are good because United States citizens think that guns are good. Because United States citizens believe that to have access to guns is meaning you are a citizen and you are a second-class citizen if you aren't able to do that. I'll take a point of information in closing. No, we're good. Okay?
Do you think that when a victim of police shooting is found to be the member of a race-based militia, that copy of the New York Post will somehow pass up the opportunity to range about racial online police on it?
Oh, of course not, but they own illegal guns, right? No one in the police authority is giving guns or like
accepting the license applications from known members of violent NRA organizations. Like the Black Panther example that they get didn't even buy their guns legally, right? They bought them illegally through a process, and that was why they tightened up the ability to sell and smuggle these types of guns. But secondly, even if we win on the non-consequentialism, we also win on the consequentialism. Because the two arguments we've got for opening government, that there are more guns, which is presumably true, because some people might be persuaded to buy illegally, and you get safety from accidents. I don't understand the violence link, but you definitely get safety from accidents and hurting yourself accidentally. What are our consequential additions to this debate? Firstly, if you are buying your guns from other criminal actors, you are now vulnerable to those criminals for two reasons. Firstly, Home Depot isn't going to hunt you down if you can't pay off your license, right? There are consumer protections you just naturally get when you're not buying from illegal criminals. But secondly, how do illegal criminals get the guns that they sell? They steal them. And now these gangs know that you have a gun in your house that you can't report stolen. They will then tell someone to go and steal that gun back from you. And it's a vicious cycle of violence where gangs both sell you guns and then take them away from you. But secondly, now you are a criminal. And in the context of vicious police violence and overreach, that is a bad thing. Because two reasons. Firstly, if the police catch you with a gun, you have a criminal record, you possession of a legal firearm, that can mass incarceration, ruin your chance of ever getting a job, ruin your chance of ever getting education. But also, there's more incentive to search you, because if police officers know that you are likely to have an illegal gun because they've engineered a system where you can't own a legal gun, they now know that they can catch you with having that illegal gun. And they want to catch you with illegal acts, so there's more incentive for them to be violent. Clearly, this debate isn't won and lost on the external debate. It's about the rights and consequences to the people this organization represents.
I thank the member of government for that speech. I would now like to welcome the member of the opposition to begin their case.
The first thing I'm going to do is dispose of the extension that we just get from closing government. The second thing I'm going to do is deal with the more substantive contribution that we get from opening government and step through why this would have allowed the NRA to alternatively be a more effective voice that would have stood for Black Americans and why that would have been better.
Firstly, the extension we get from closing government is that Home Depot workers are so racist that they will risk their job and that they will risk federal legislation on anti-discrimination laws in order to block the applications of guns from African American people. They do not do nearly enough analysis to establish, firstly, that this is true. There are criteria on which you're allowed to deny someone's application for a gun in the United States. And the problem in this debate is not that those are particularly onerous. The problem in this debate, and indeed in the United States of America, is they are not onerous at all. But secondly, they never gave how this fixed that at all, because that's a legal issue, yeah? And that's what they're assumedly lobbying for, is they want those things to be reversed. But the problem is, in the US, Home Depot is just a normal store. And if you as a Black American go into a normal store, apply for a gun and are rejected because of the color of your skin, we already have laws against that because you're being denied service in a store because of the color of your skin. So if they say that that is an ineffective fix because law enforcement and the police system are racist, they are the same law enforcement bodies and police bodies that would be applying the laws they're theoretically arguing for to be gun specific. So it is unclear what solution they want this body to be advocating for. If it is a legal solution, why that would be more effective than consumer protections which already exist in the United States for consumer goods, or if they're lobbying for something else, because honestly, it was never, ever mentioned in that member's speech what particular legal reform or political reform they wanted to have. Now I'm going to deal with the actual case that we get from opening government. So why this would have allowed people to join the NRA and why that would have been better. Firstly, the NRA is extremely based in white nationalism, as they admit, and they list loads of reasons why that is true. The majority of those stemming from the fact that the people involved in that organization are predominantly white and predominantly Southern. It is unique in the United States that there is allowed to be a group that is that large and that powerful, which is entirely racially segregated, which owns on a national level pride in Southern nationalism and white nationalism, and which is not consistently maligned on that basis. Part of the reason why it is permitted to exist is because the existence of a separate and racialized Black body licenses the NRA to be a separate and white nationalist white body, because Black people have opted out of that body continually and said it is legitimate to base your gun ownership in your racial identity. The NRA is enabled to continue to do this. Why is this a terrible thing? The first thing is, as OG points out, the NRA is one of the most powerful lobbying bodies in the United States. They are one of the most important bodies in shaping legislation around guns, and the existence of a separate, distinct, and significantly less powerful Black body means that that policy is shaped in an entirely white echo chamber. We admit that in an alternative world, the chances that you get a perfectly racially diversified NRA are low, but the fact that there is some Black voice in that room when policy agendas are being discussed is important, because they then shape the legislation which affects the legal rights of Black Americans in the United States in a way that this group never will. But secondly, the NRA, at this point here, isn't even contingent on making the NRA better. This is a point that is just bad for this group to exist, which is that they never want to face up to the fact that this is a group that targets African American communities and introduces them to guns. And they try to run away from this at a couple of points. We hear from Deputy that they're not being introduced to guns. We hear at closing that they're otherwise buying illegal guns. But you have to read the mandate that was set in this info slide, which is one of their main aims is to introduce guns to these communities, which means they're then faced with a particular conundrum, which is either they admit that this group is failing one of its key mandates, which means it has little practical effect and our licensing of the NRA's racism point becomes more important, or that it is achieving one of its key mandates and it is making these communities have increased access to guns. The fact is that gun ownership in communities is never a good thing. It is directly correlated with the deaths of women and children because there are guns in their homes, and if someone is violent, that turns a hospital trip into a funeral. You need to accept that what we are regretting in this debate is that there is a group which has actively targeted Black communities in order to introduce, and it's not funny, so stop laughing, in order to introduce them to guns, which then enter these homes and affect people's safety. The fact is that this is a group that, yes, may have discursive benefits, but which has actively sought to increase violence in these communities. Thirdly, why is it good that we have a Black lobby group? Before I move on, I'll take over.
Given your own analysis about how racist the NRA is, it's deeply unclear why Black people would ever join or why they would be listened to. I told you they can join both organisations and will be more likely to join the NRA if they have experience in another lobby group first.
Yeah, and that is a good point. The problem is when integration happened in the United States, most bodies became progressively less racist because progressively you had more integration of Black and white people. The fact that they chose to segregate themselves out allowed the NRA to continue in a more racist fashion, which means now it is exclusive and now it is not an option to join the NRA because it is being licensed to be exclusive in that way. Why is this not the autonomous Black lobby group slam dunk that they tried to claim? First thing is that most African Americans do not agree with this group. Most African Americans agree with the much larger group, Black Lives Matter, which is explicitly anti-gun. OG says that this is a good group because they're seen to be anti-gun but pro-controls on police usage of guns, but they never step through how that's perceived, which is Black people want more gun ownership and they want the police to be disempowered in the face of that gun ownership. That looks like they want to accelerate violence against police in that community, and that's how it will be perceived as hypocrisy. But secondly, the size of this group compared to Black Lives Matter in a context where OG gives us the reasons why this group is platformed in the media, because it seems like a more even debate, because it is more attention grabbing, actually sidelines the voices of the majority of the African American community who do not want increased guns in their community, who see them as something which leads to the disproportionate deaths of young men in particular in those communities. At the end of this debate, they didn't get more autonomy, they crowded out the majority of these communities and they increased violence perhaps in a gate.
I thank the member of the opposition for that speech. I'd like to remind members of the audience to maintain order throughout other speakers' speeches and not be distracting, because that's really distracting in a final and a stressful situation. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to the government representative.
Look, beyond closing opposition's extensions, it seemed that their biggest new contribution was formatting our extension, because it's not the case that a Home Depot individual is the person that is deciding whether or not you get a gun. It is the FBI or the other organization that has to go through the 7-day process and engage in background checks and has absolute discretion and no form of public scrutiny, which means oftentimes, yes, African Americans en masse are discriminated against because you cannot directly and tangibly point to discrimination. Like, I've heard so many teams run anti-discrimination laws exist, and it's still a ridiculous line of argumentation that does not deal with the way they are ill-equipped to deal with systems that have large systems of discretion in place. Which means all our material about the proliferation of illegal arms still stands in this debate. This is still a harm that closing has not dealt with and will have to deal with in their whip speech. Keep this in mind, because it means that as we position ourselves in this debate, beyond our non-consequentialist contribution that they haven't responded to, there is still a massive problem with illegal firearms that we were the team to first address that has not been dealt with. 3 questions. Firstly, what is the backlash case dealing with open opposition? That's literally all it was. Secondly, is there a right to bear arms that we should principally consider in this debate being consequential considerations? And then lastly, how do we best promote African American safety when it comes to owning firearms? First, though, I want to deal with COO's contribution separately because I think they are not directly tied to the debate itself. First, the NRA could have more African American people in it. Firstly, their case seems to be in tension here because they're quite worried, for example, about NAGA effectively introducing guns into African American homes, but at the same time they want people to join the NRA and also promote getting guns in their homes. So it's unclear how their own case works given it's directly contradicting each other. But also, I just think opening government has responded to this already preemptively and they did not deal with this. The fact that, like, African American people have no power inside the NRA as it stands. And to go a bit further, the way in which the NRA crafts policy and administration is through local forums. People are elected for particular positions and they got the hierarchy. If you're an African American person given the overwhelming white membership, when it comes to question time, you are, funny enough, by the moderator, not allowed to ask your question. You are the person that is not invited to speak on the stage. You are the person that never gets to have your voice heard, and you are the person that has no capacity whatsoever to influence how the NRA operates. But remember, as opening points out, and we explain to a greater extent, the NRA is fundamentally built upon racism. Because the way in which the NRA leverages its political power is to soak up white nationalism to the extent that they can weaponize voters against their positions in primaries in safe Republican seats or in swing seats and marginal seats. They weaponize it against candidates and that have pro-guns in that culture. In terms of their safety material, I think this also falls out. Even if you ignore their contradiction, you think these 2 points can still stand separately, it is the case that guns already exist inside African American homes, and it's better that they come from a legal regime. Okay. First question, but first opening.
People buy guns illegally because they cannot get them through legal means. If that is the case, it would be illegal for the NAAGA to give them guns. So why do these people suddenly stop buying guns?
It's not about them giving guns, it's about them becoming like an activist and lobbying organisation that tries to break down discrimination inside these organisations and uses their leverage and political power and resourcing to engage in investigations and crackdowns where you go, oh, it turns out discrimination did take place here, where you engage in sting operations. It's not about arming people. That is absolutely ludicrous. First question, backlash, the OO case. Look, when it comes to like having an active police response or something like this, whatever the line was here, the reality is that given it is the case that people already own guns, and there's maybe a marginal increase as the opening government points out, there's no additional incentive for them to be allocated more police resources in their case because the quantum of guns doesn't change. Like, maybe you would if you buy their propaganda campaign, but that's unlikely to be realistic given the people that compose this group and associated with it are people that want to legally own guns and aren't going to be those that engage in acts of violence. If anything, it works in the reverse though, because at the point that you have an active organization that's saying, like, African American gun ownership is something about being respectable and protecting your family, and you have nice fluffy images, it actually takes a lot of the sting off that political discourse and on the margins reduces political incentives inside particular jurisdictions to not actually like crack down in that way. In terms of the political response, the response is effectively the same. Like, we are not saying that racism against African Americans is going to disappear overnight, particularly the debate around firearms. But that alternative voice is likely on the margins to reduce the amount of money that's allocated at the moment to harming African American people, given at the moment there is a strong countervailing norm that gangs are everywhere and they have guns. When it's not gangs and instead is legal firearm users being responsible, that is just simply better. In terms of their contribution about resource allocation, I think Daniel's already dealt with this sufficiently. Like, these are people that want to engage in firearms in particular, and so spending money on NAGA. They are not going to be spending it on things like funding African Americans when it comes to court cases. They're people that will put their money into the NRA, because they still want to be involved in that, even though they're going to be systematically excluded. So they're just putting their money into a worse organisation at this point, and it's better they put it into something rather than nothing at all. Secondly then, right to bear arms. And note, the DLO's attempt to deal with this was to say the consequences are so extreme that therefore this principle shouldn't be considered. I think, panel, you should recognise that their characterisation was incredibly absurd from opening opposition and was unrealistic. We think this debate is reasonably marginal in terms of the way in which it affects this debate. But the important contribution is that we finally do something to deal with rampant discrimination that's happened. Rights are something that are constructed by particular societies. They apply differently in how they're constructed. When they ought to exist, you as a person have a right, regardless of your skin colour, gender or ethnicity, to be able to access that right in the same way. Regardless of any normative claims about the right itself, the very fact that it is applied discriminatorily is something that's harmful, is something we ought to stand against in this debate. And this organisation, as I've already flagged in responses, is the group that is best equipped to change narratives around that. Closing says discrimination doesn't exist. I tell you what, the Brady Bill, the fact that there is a 7-day waiting period on firearms that goes through discretionary mechanisms, that there are unaccountable FBI watch lists, that means discrimination does happen. Lastly, on safety, and this is the part of our extension that closing didn't respond to when we went consequentialist as well. Because opening points out that African Americans already own guns, but don't go so far as to say that actually a lot of ownership is illegal at the moment, which means people are necessarily exposed to criminals and gangs. Daniel has already flagged a lot of the material here and talked about the way in which you are now exposed to gang violence and exposed to criminals as a necessary part of arming yourselves. We think these are particularly vulnerable people that feel afraid in America, that feel afraid of police acting against them violently, that feel a need to be armed, and they are always going to need to get guns. That side of the house makes the very act of watching you be expressing a right something that becomes dangerous and life-threatening when you are exposed to people that you otherwise ought to not reasonably have been exposed to. At the end of this debate, we have simply gone ahead of these teams. They probably should have been more responsive at closing opposition.
Thank you to the government whip for that speech. I'd now like to welcome the opposition whip speaker to conclude the debate. Here.
Two things in this speech. First, the value of gun ownership, and second, the possibility of gun reform. First, on the value of gun ownership. The government bench sets themselves an incredibly high burden in this debate because they concede, as is pretty self-evident, guns are bad in general. That is a very simple premise which is accepted by every team in this debate. More guns means more homicides, and that is bad. What that means is that these guys need to prove an enormously high specific value of African American gun ownership in order to overcome that general harm. Let's see how they do. Firstly, from opening, we get 3 benefits. The first is that having a gun makes you feel safe, particularly as an African American person in a context of the USA. That firstly is untrue if you believe the material we give you, which gives you very little response about how you are targeted more by white people who feel more afraid of you and those communities, or whether more guns within any community internally makes people feel more unsafe and more unstable. That does not stand. But the second thing to note is that even to the extent that is true, that benefit is exceptionally marginal for the reason that you still live in an incredibly racist and violent society which forces over-policing upon you. If you feel slightly more safe because you have a gun, that is not a benefit that you should weigh highly against the prevailing context of racism and white violence. The engagement we get with this from opposing government is to suggest, well, things are already bad. Firstly, as our opening correctly says, things could obviously get worse. But second, in a discursive sense, talking about kind of the suburban image of black gun ownership is also really bad in kind of a different but pretty also similarly bad way, in that it's very hard. That's a stereotype that is much harder for African Americans to distance themselves from, because you can be like, well, obviously I'm not in a gang. But if you're saying, well, even normal African Americans, if the NRA is saying things like that, or Fox News is saying things like that, even normal people are owning guns and being violent, then that is a stereotype that pervades entire communities rather than small segments of them. The second claim we get from opening government is, well, perhaps these particular gun owners are safer because this organisation teaches people to use guns safely, which you just cannot do. Obviously, even if you're not saying homicide is actively good, guns will always be dangerous. There will always be harms, as every team in this debate concedes. The better push is to suggest, well, there's just only quite a marginal increase in who joins because it's not you're buying new guns, you're just joining the association, which is obviously untrue. No, thank you. The point of this association is to make it more popular and introduce African Americans to gun ownership. Or if that's not the case, they lose all of their benefits of having an active voice in politics, which is why that does not stand. At closing government, the intrinsic value of gun ownership evolves in 2 directions. The first is to suggest that African American owners are under the status quo, on our side, are denied rights to legal arms and should have that. This is a bizarre argument for reasons that Rachel gives you, which do not get a response that is not dismissive. The first reason it is bizarre is because this association does not change that. If your problem is with white sellers or the FBI, it is
Speaker.
I have no idea how this association is going to either make the FBI not racist or fix the point at that point in the chain, right? You're changing African American interaction with guns, not white people or the FBI's. But secondly, under their characterization, it's grandmas and suburban homes which are getting guns. That is not people who are getting them illegally from gangs under our side, and they do not change that. But thirdly, if that is the case, that's a reason for people to deny guns to African Americans more when they're purchasing them in legal ways, because white people are more afraid and more racist by the perceived threat of this group. And that means all of their harms about criminalization are at best symmetric or at worst exacerbated on their side. The second push they give is, well, you have an intrinsic right to bear arms, but that really doesn't cut it, because we are obviously not banning African Americans from buying guns. We're just saying this one particular way of facilitating that is very harmful, and we should not support that as a push. And what that means then at the end of this issue, that even if this is slightly better than the alternative, which I'm going to show that it is not, you still massively increase gun violence, you still massively increase gun ownership, and they do not do enough to prove or to mitigate the harms of those things in these specific instances, which means they have a huge burden to overcome in terms of the possibility of reform. Second issue in this speech then, the possibility of reform. Opening government and closing government as well says, and this is kind of the, final sort of potential win strat, that the NRA is so powerful and so racist, it's always going to exist, the best we can do is mitigate it. We have two responses to this, which is to show it is not inevitable that it will be powerful and it is not inevitable it will be racist. But firstly, I'll take our clothing.
The mechanisms that you glossed over was that NAGA will help people find businesses that do selling guns and navigate the legal complexities of the system, as well as funding the lawsuits and investigating discrimination. Can you have a response to the mechanisms we run rather than a straw man characterization?
Okay, firstly, empirically and also quite intuitively, this organization is not powerful enough to fund lawsuits against every instance of discrimination or to change the way that the FBI operates, for God's sake. Like, that will not happen. But as I said before, it is likely not targeting people who would alternatively be buying guns from gangs under your characterization is about suburban families. So, in terms of the potential for reform, no thank you. We tell you that the NRA is not always going to be powerful, right? It would still be powerful, but it would be weaker and less racist on our side because it is declining in power, because of things like the visibility of mass shootings, the visibility of police brutality. Groups like Black Lives Matter, whose voices are being heard and who are being effective. Now on their side, you lose the African American base that would have supported that reform. You make white people who are racist scared of those individuals. You delegitimize narratives about police brutality or de-racialize gun violence because you say, well, black people have guns too. That is awful. Their push is to say, well, the NRA will always be racist and exclusionary of black people, so it's better that you have this alternative organization. But that is responded to very neatly by our extension when we tell you that this is circular, because on our side, when black people were in the NRA, that would have been better and that would have become less racist. The response from closing government that, well, this is just a contradiction because the NRA, is kind of pro-gun. Obviously, it doesn't directly introduce people to guns the way this organization does, and on the comparative, it would be preferable. But note secondly, that even if black people had less of a voice in the NRA, this still crowds out other movements like Black Lives Matter, which would have been anti-gun and would have pushed for that reform. The other, only other piece of mitigation we get from opening up government is to say, well, you could be a useful political lobby group. Firstly, it is preferable to be anti-gun rather than pro-responsible gun use, especially as we explain how this takes away power from voices like Black Lives Matter activism. And note this also undercuts and divides progressive movements, because you either have to be like, yeah, this is super awesome, or you have to critique an autonomous African-American organization in a way that is really bad. But, thirdly, if it is true that the NRA is so powerful as they suggest, then it's unlikely that this organization will be good at fighting against it. And what that will mean is that it's incredibly important, because government bench concedes that gun ownership is bad and says that, well, in the context of inevitable and white-controlled gun ownership, we ought to mitigate that racism and violence as best we can. But at closing opposition, we uniquely show that this white-controlled gun ownership is not inevitable, and that is the only thing that cuts their remaining win strategy out from under them, and that is why we propose.
Thank all speakers for an excellent debate. I'm ready to press the